Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database. And like many other shows, the content comes from Google Alerts. And a couple weeks ago, I saw a Google Alert story about school security technology and the school security industry. And it was a network news story that had a pretty lengthy video piece in there. And it highlighted all of these different vendors and all these different ways the technology was being used. And at the very end of it, there was a university professor who got about 15 seconds. And for anybody who has done major network news or documentaries or other productions, you spend hours recording. I did one earlier this year for a network. We recorded for almost 2 hours ahead of this story. And I got about maybe 15 or 20 seconds. So I knew that the guy at the end of this story had a lot more to say. So the guest on the show today is Dr. Dan Semenza. He's from Rutgers University, Department of Sociology and Criminology. He's also the director of the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center. So Dan, thanks so much for coming to the show.
Thank you for having me, David. Pleasure to be here.
So before we jump into it, how sad were you when your big network news story finally came out and you had 15 seconds? Can we just kind of walk through the day of the filming and then the day that the story actually came out?
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, I think at this point I'm like you. I'm getting used to it. I'm kind of learning what to expect when you get the invitation and when you get the ask to come on to these things. And obviously, I take it as much as possible because it's just an opportunity to be able to kind of correct misperceptions and educate the public whenever you can. But when you get these invitations, as you know, it's often like you are at the beck and call. They are going to let you know the date at the latest possible moment. Where you're going to film is a total mystery until hours before. And so it just so happened that where the producer was versus where I was, I ended up driving like an hour just to get to the location. And then once we were at the location, it was probably about, all in like an hour and a half, 2 hours of filming and prep and everything. And then, radio silence, not knowing how long it was going to take before anything actually aired. But when it did, the producer let me know, and he's like, "You're in there, but it's short and sweet." And that's when I knew that it was going to be a quick clip. And you know what? It's just par for the course, and any opportunity is a good one. So yeah, I was ready for it.
And that's a big reason that I was interested in creating a podcast because, you do hours of interviews, you've got great messages out there. There's a lot more that you want to say, and you just never have the opportunity to say it. But unfortunately, this is a week and a month where there is a lot to say. This is the first time in recent memory where there have been 2 deliberately planned attacks that have taken place at K through 12 schools in such close proximity this month. Earlier this month, there was a planned attack at a Seventh-day Adventist school in Northern California. This was a man in his 50s. He was from the Seventh-day Adventist community, so he was really familiar with what to say, how to behave. And he made an appointment at the school using a fake name and said that he wanted to take a tour of the campus to talk about enrolling a kid. That's something that happens at schools all over the country all the time because schools need to enroll students, especially private schools and religious schools. And a first part of that is a parent may want to come tour the campus and observe it. And everything seemed normal. This is a guy shuffling around in a sweater, and then he pulls a gun out and he shoots 2 kids on the playground and kills himself. If that wasn't bad enough, then this week in Madison, Wisconsin, a 15-year-old girl pulls out a gun and opens fire in a study hall at a pretty small religious K through 12 school there in Madison, Wisconsin. The Abundant Life school there is about 400 students, so not a big campus, not a lot of resources by any means. But these attacks sit kind of opposite to this enormous school security industry that's been created to stop them. And so that's why I have Dan on to talk today. He gave a wonderful 15 seconds on network news about the school security industry, but I think he actually has more than an hour of information to go over about this. So, Dan, can we start by kind of what does school security mean to you, and how have you seen it kind of evolve and change as you've been researching?
Sure. Yeah. So when I think about school security, I think about it from kind of a holistic perspective. That's the technology that schools might use, cameras, and metal detectors, the personnel that schools might include, school resource officers, police officers, whether they're armed or not. Um, and I think about kind of the strategies and preventative approaches that they might have on the books. So that might be anything from threat assessment teams that are at the schools or linked up to the schools, to drilling in preparation for the students and the teachers, the curriculum that might undergird any of that kind of drilling. So I think some people might just think about the tech components of school security, and like that, it's a $3 billion industry, one that continues to grow and really has taken off, I think, really since the shooting at Columbine. But it's not just the technology, it's all these other components that go into it. The tech is what gets the most attention, and the tech is where the money is. And so I think that's where the conversation really needs to be had, because all of this is just about what happened at the school rather than thinking much more broadly about what happened before school, the laws that are in place, the accountability, the access to guns, all of these other factors that we can get into before the issue of security is really even a question.
And that's important that you point out how the tech is different, because security to any place, whether it's a building or an event venue or a school, it sits in four different components. And one is your personnel, and that would be a person whose job it is to do security. And at a school, in most cases, that person would be a municipal employee. They might be a police officer who's employed by that jurisdiction or the school district, or a security guard that's hired to work at that school. But there's not really any company that necessarily profits from that. In most cases, that's just an expense the school has to pay. Now, the physical building itself can have security, and that can be all of your physical items would be a door, whether that door is fortified or not, your windows, the design of a building. And that has a market in some places, but it's generally a one-time investment. If you decide we're going to buy doors, we buy them once. The third element is kind of security hardware. That would be something like a metal detector or a camera. And in most cases, those are going to be also, really a one-time purchase, but maybe something you might get an updated version of every 5 or 10 years. But they would probably be from different vendors, and they're not particularly high profit margin items. And then what Dan pointed out, the last one, where really has become $1 billion industry, is software. And that's because software can be an ongoing subscription. It's developed once, and then it's profits forever for a company. And there's been an incredible amount of software across all these different security spaces in schools. So Dan, could you kind of elaborate on kind of the types of software and the ways that this stuff is being used in schools?
Well, so I'll talk about one software in particular that was kind of the focus of that piece that I did, that I think was, you know, that has gotten a lot of steam. Um, and this is kind of this AI detection software to be able to kind of use in conjunction with security cameras, that is allegedly designed to detect whether or not somebody pulls a gun out. This is one that kind of stood out as a company that's marketing itself as being able to basically detect when somebody is pulling out a gun, and then alleges to be able to ping really, really quickly police and law enforcement more broadly, school resource officers, whoever might be administering in the building so that the threat can essentially be neutralized and assessed. Um, and so this is software that gets updated all the time. It can be sold on a subscription basis. Um, and so this is one example, and David, I'd be curious of other ones that might come to mind for you, where, like you said, it's not just hardware installation; it's kind of a layer on top of the visual detection that just comes with your kind of everyday normal security cameras, and can be paid year after year after year. And the problem with that is, and we can certainly get into it more if you want. Does the tech work? Well, we don't really have any good evidence to suggest that it does, right? There's very, very little research on something like this, and really all of the other technology that is out there that works to be target hardening and to prevent mass shootings, like the ones that you talk about in the open. But not only does it work, is it the kind of thing that is, providing protection for schools with the kind of investment that is being asked, right? My first question is always, when these companies come up, wow, where all of a sudden are schools getting all of this money, right? There's a budget that schools are going to have, unless they're, private schools and they have their own budget. Um, and that's going to be, it's a zero sum game, right? It's got to be spent one way or the other. So how is there all of a sudden for schools money, or expected to be money, for this kind of AI threat detection, when there's often not money to provide very basic resources to schools and teachers like that? So
Yeah, and on the money side, that's really a bubble that happened largely because of Uvalde. And there was an enormous amount of federal COVID relief money that was allocated to states. And after Uvalde, a lot of states reallocated that money towards school security, because it had to be spent over a relatively short period of time. A lot of that money went into multi-year contracts. Because if you sign a 5-year lease for a product, you can expend all of those COVID dollars before they expire. So I want to talk about kind of two different major kind of classes of school security technology right now. One is somehow making your cameras at the school smart, and the other one is making your entry scanners, your metal detectors, smart, and kind of parse through a couple issues in both of those spaces. So looking at the 5 planned attacks this year, in Perry, Iowa, there was a student who came into the school early with his guns in a duffel bag, came out of the bathroom with the guns and opened fire in the hallway. And he killed himself before police arrived. In that instance, if you have a security camera in the school, the gun isn't visible until he starts shooting, so it doesn't do anything. If you have a panic button in the school, it doesn't matter because he's dead immediately before the first police officer got there. And when he arrives an hour before classes start, who's going to be working at your security checkpoint if you have next generation scanners and metal detectors? So things kind of fall apart really quickly in that scenario. Then,
yeah,
go ahead, Dan.
no, I mean, this is something I think about all the time, is the any kind of technology that you're putting into a school for security is only as good as the personnel that can work it, the people that can interpret it, and its ability to kind of plug all of the potential holes and catch people at all of these different points in time or locations and places around the school. And it's just an impossibility unless it is a complete fortress. And even then, that you are going to be able to say that any security solution is airtight, right? Especially for people who already go to the school, who already know, and in the cases that you talked about just this month, there were people who were likely familiar to some degree or another with the school, or the practices of the school, who already go to the school, who already know the practices, who might know the security layout, and might just be familiar with what they have to avoid, even if there are cameras or metal detectors, and things like that. So this is almost more of a fundamental problem to just thinking about security, hardware or software, as a means of prevention, is because you're starting with a smaller net than you would be if you were addressing firearm access or some of the legislative things that we could be thinking about. And that smaller net is just going to mean that you are going to have holes that people are going to slip through, and then you end up with the kind of shooting that we're talking about now. So yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but just wanted to wholeheartedly agree that that's a great example of where something like this fails.
And unfortunately, in all of these different variations, you would see the same types of failures across these different classes of common school security. So to kind of add to those, let's think about, object detection on a camera, an entry screening, a police officer in the school, and a panic button. At Appalachia High in Georgia in September, a student puts an AR-15 rifle inside a big poster board like you'd take to the science fair. And he tapes that up, comes on the school bus, comes into the school, takes that to the bathroom, opens it up, and then opens fire during morning classes. That hits all the most common circumstances, an insider during morning classes who's allowed to be there. Now, say that school had entry screening. You're trying to get, 2,000 kids through your entry screening to get them into class in time. They have backpacks, gym bags, laptops, metallic items, keys, all these other things that are setting your metal detector off constantly. And there's a kid who's got his poster board for the science fair and it's all taped up. What security guard is going to have time amid searching through all these different bags to take the risk of damaging this kid's science project by cutting it open to look inside the poster board? That's just not realistic. He comes out of the bathroom. You're not going to have cameras in the bathroom. You're not going to see him with that gun because he's inside the bathroom stall. Now he opens fire. If there's a panic button, it doesn't matter at this point. There's never been a shortage of 911 calls or emergency calls. So that panic button doesn't do anything in that case. And finally, that school had 2 school resource officers working there. It's a 2 million square foot campus. Unless your school resource officers are next to every single kid at every time, what are the chances that they're going to be right there when the shooting starts? So I think when we start breaking down these different scenarios, it's not that, one thing works well here and one thing, works well there. Actually, most of them don't work at all for most of your different scenarios.
Yeah, I completely agree. The all of the technology is always geared to these very specific circumstances, right? They are not these wide blanket approaches, that can catch a whole bucket of scenarios. So not only are they really permeable in kids, frankly, finding a way to get around these things. I mean, wrapping your gun in a poster board for a project is not to make light of it, but nothing if not innovative, right? Kids, if they're smarter than we give them credit for, and they're going to find a way to do things if they're really motivated to do them, especially if they're insiders and they already know what kind of tech is there. But yeah, the security technology is often only for very specific use cases, and so like they look really cool in demos, right? It can be very impressive when you see demonstration and you're put into the mindset of these particular circumstances. When I was in grad school, first couple of years, to make money, I sold software. And part of selling software was I gave demos to people. And those demos were highly curated for very particular circumstances. And I hope to God that nobody asked any questions outside of the bounds of those particular circumstances, because I often didn't have answers or the ability to show them a demo in a more flexible way that would address maybe their particular need, right? The same thing is happening here when you see these really snazzy demos from a lot of tech companies, is they are meant to really get you excited and think, wow, this can apply into all these different kind of circumstances. But you can quickly start poking holes into that when you realize that there's no way that this is applicable across the board.
And with those demos, there's nothing in the moment that requires a product vendor to be truthful when they're talking to a school official. And we're seeing that with the biggest smart object detector that's been on the market for the past decade has been investigated by the SEC and the FCC. And there was just a ruling 2 weeks ago that they used deceptive marketing, that they misrepresented the capabilities of their product. It gave a list of all the things that they can no longer claim their product does. And schools that entered into this contract are able to breach them. And this is a multi-million-dollar per year service that's in major school districts all over the country. They have backing from some big Fortune 500 companies, and they were absolutely not accurate in the way that they said their product worked and the level of accuracy that it had. So I think school officials need to realize that a sales pitch is not objective. A sales pitch is not empirical evidence. And a sales pitch is whatever is going to get you to buy that product. If it seems too good to be true, old saying is it probably is. I think a way that you could apply that thinking is if somebody has a product that can identify a gun in any bag, if somebody has a product that can identify a gun on every camera, why isn't it in every federal building and courthouse and military base in the country? And if they're not in any of them, there's probably a reason why.
Right. And if the technology is so impressive, why aren't there a million competitors out there selling, similar technology, driving costs down so that it can be more affordable for schools and government entities, right? Oftentimes the response you hear from vendors is, we understand that this is expensive and we understand that it's an investment, but it's an investment worth making if you want to save the lives of children, right? And so there's a corporate incentive or there's a financial incentive on their end to sell as much as possible and have as high subscription costs as possible. And it's couched in, well, we're doing this for safety and to save children. We're just making money on the side. But, a lot of that is marketing speak and kind of deceptive ways of positioning, a sales pitch essentially. And so I think that is one of the many issues that I take with this market as a whole, but in particular some of the vendors like the one that you described is there is too much opportunity for deception. And in light of so little evidence or research that anyone can use to back themselves up to protect themselves from these claims of deception, I just find it all very, very thin and therefore, really problematic when schools are confronted with trying to make their kids safer, but also trying not to spend money on things that are needless or are going to cost them and not actually be useful.
And education budgets are tight. And just to kind of put things in perspective, so say you have a hypothetical security technology where you have to pay a license fee per camera, and say that that's $30 per camera per month at your school. Well, any school campus, if you have cameras around the outside of the building and the entryway and the different hallways, around classrooms, around the parking lot, around the athletic field, you can easily have 200 cameras at the school. Well, suddenly that's $72,000 just for that one school to have one piece of technology. And if you're a mid-sized school district that has 50 campuses, that's $3.6 million per year. $3.6 million is an incredible amount of money when you think that the average school teacher in the country makes about $40,000 to $50,000 a year. Like you're talking about the cost of your staff for an entire program. Like maybe that's all of your music staff. Maybe that's all of your special education aides. All of those people combined in a mid-sized school district are the cost of 1 year of a lease for a piece of software that probably doesn't do anything in the majority of your circumstances.
Yeah, and this is at the same time, and I mean, my mom was a school teacher. I was working in public schools for a while, and this is at the same time. Not only are school teachers getting paid way less than they should, but they're often having to buy their own supplies, and their books and their pencils, and some of the tech that they bring into the classroom on their own dollar. So, what what I frankly am not familiar with, and I'd be curious if you are, is how are the school districts that are employing some of this technology even carving into their budgets to be able to afford this? I mean, you just did that back of the napkin math really quickly, and it just goes to show that, I mean, it's essentially for any public school system unaffordable without cutting massive programs. So I frankly don't even see how this is really even feasible, but obviously school systems are finding a way to do it.
Yeah, there are really three main areas that security, whether it's physical security or police or these different technology leases, get funded at schools. It's either federal grants, and in the upcoming year, there's talk about cutting 20 or 30% of the federal budget, getting rid of the entire Department of Education, getting rid of the Department of Justice. A huge amount of money from those agencies goes into schools, specifically for school security and school policing. After a big incident, there are also states that have a state rainy day fund that they tap into. After Uvalde, Texas moved $100 million from the state rainy day fund into school security. They spent 50 million, so half of that money just went on to ballistic shields only for school resource officers. So in Uvalde, if anybody's seen the videos from the camera, there are dozens of police officers with shields and rifles. But the solution post Uvalde was to spend $50 million on more shields for officers that already had them. I'm not really clear on that. So federal grants, state grants. The other piece is doing a special tax assessment. And in some schools, they've proposed specific tax assessments where you're paying extra tax dollars to either fund this equipment, fund this software, or fund police at the schools. And aside from that, your only other option is to cut teachers or to cut other education programs.
Yeah, and so, all of those places are are opportunities where money can be far better spent. I mean, the Uvalde case is an obvious one. Not only were those cameras showing dozens of officers that had the shield, but the officers weren't going in and they were not addressing the threat, right? And so now you're going to double shield officers who still weren't doing anything in the first place. Um, I think it's fair to be critical of that response, and a lot of people were, because it was so ineffective. But then, yeah, something like kind of the tax approach, well, that's still putting the onus on the schools. So even if they're not getting the money from the federal government, where again money could be better spent, um, you're now asking schools to bear the responsibility of protecting their students, where it should be the government that is funding those schools to provide that safety, and specifically the kind of everyday, not the rainy day, funding from states to ensure that schools are safe. But that does not mean that the states should now all of a sudden be ramping up their budgets for some of this technology. The states need to be supporting some of the legislative approaches, some of the legal ways that you might be thinking about approaching this, and really steering away from this more tech heavy approach that just really has no backing to it.
Well, it also comes down to the question of what does school safety mean? Because there's the active shooter industry is built around having a scary outsider in tactical gear and combat boots who's going to slowly and methodically march up to your school holding their rifle. And as long as you have ballistic doors or a secure entryway, they're not going to be able to get in. And now you've prevented violence, and you have a safe active shooter proof school. Yes, a lot of these technologies will stop that situation, but that situation is not reality. The reality is almost all school shootings are current or former students, and it starts a surprise attack inside the school. It begins and ends in the same room, and it's over in less than 2 minutes. Almost all planned attacks at schools end in suicide, the shooter surrendering, or um, other staff and students subduing the shooter. It's very rare that it's law enforcement that ends a school shooting. So what we have is security that's built around one thing, but we have a threat of a planned attack that's completely different. On top of that, at schools, there's all kinds of other gun violence. There's school-based conflicts. There are fights that escalate. There's gang violence. There's criminal activity. There's suicides. There's accidents. There are accidents involving school police officers firing their guns. What does safety mean from guns? And what does safety mean even more broadly with all the other things that can harm a student?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think that a much broader definition is critical if you're trying to actually address this rather than just be caught off your back foot and thinking about this from a fear-based approach, right? And so that stereotypical idea of, this invader coming from outside the walls and coming in is the one that frankly I think a lot of the companies market based on, right? And you can see this in a lot of the marketing material that is used. Um, it's the reason why I think we've gotten away from, at least researchers, but I think some schools are pulling away from this idea that we should be drilling with this kind of intruder mentality where kids are terrified because somebody from the outside is going to be roaming the halls with tactical gear and stuff. Um, we have these images of like the kids at Columbine, even though they were students there, but because of what they were wearing and because of some of those like things that I think were just seared in a lot of our minds, that fear is what administrators are basing their decisions off of, and it's what companies are pitching their wares from. And it's not allowing us to really pull back and say, look, this is a much, much bigger issue in terms of how we're thinking about safety within the schools, but then how do we think about reducing gun violence broadly? That includes school-based shootings. Like these situational components where a child brings a gun to school, it happens very quickly. They bring it in the morning or in the classroom. Like that is a specific circumstance, but it's a symptom of the much broader problem of relative ease of access to guns, the differences that we have in state laws from one place to the next. Right? It's all indicative of the same issue with suicide and community-based violence and domestic violence, right? All of these things cohere, and that is where I think it gets at this question of broader safety that you're talking about. It is not. This is one part of it. It is arguably the most devastating and most public part of it. But we have to stop thinking of it as a specific thing with a specific solution. No, we have to zoom way, way out.
And doing a simple cost benefit analysis on it, those decisions become pretty clear. Because if you're a school administrator at that mid-sized school district and you're looking at spending $3.5 million on a product, what is that product going to do for you? Because if kids are being physically assaulted, sexually assaulted, bullied, there's vaping, there's drug use in the school, there are kids who carry guns habitually that they keep in their backpack or in their waistband. There is a suicide that can happen. There might be domestic violence where an intimate partner targets, child drop off because they know that their spouse is going to be there. There are accidents as you have people carrying guns in schools. So if you look at that and you start assigning likelihoods, and then you get all the way down to, is there going to be a guy in a trench coat and sunglasses and combat boots who's slowly marching across our parking lot? And if we get our alert from this system in time, then we can shut the front door and he's not going to be able to get in. Well, where does that sit? And are the $3.5 million to stop that worth all of these other situations that may be going unaddressed, or all of the places those resources are going to be taken from? But I think to some of your other research, a lot of these things really shouldn't even happen at the school level. It's a lot of broader social decisions and a lot of federal, state, and local legislative decisions that have put schools into this impossible position of trying to stop a threat that's really not stoppable.
Right, exactly. And the one thing I'll say to your point about all of these other things that really kind of impede safety within school is the fact is, and it does not feel this way sometimes, especially this week when you hear about shooting. And we know from the data that you have worked with that school shootings are increasing, right? But the fact still, and I believe this, and I think that there's data to support it, is that schools are the safest places for children to be, right? That is particularly true for children who come from poor, more disadvantaged communities where there's a lot more opportunity for violence and victimization and abuse and all of these other things that may happen. Getting kids into a school and getting them, cared for by their teachers and by all the folks that are there is still the best way to protect them, right? So the only reason I push back on that is because I think this is the thing that a lot of the marketing companies and the tech companies forget, and they try to position schools as all of this sudden this really dangerous, scary place, and we have to harden them because this is no longer where you can feel safe, right? And you can't feel good about bringing your kids here. And despite how devastating it is to see these things happen, and I'm a parent, and so I know this very um, intimately, I still recognize that when I drop my son off to school, that he is, in one of the safest places that he can be. So I think it's just really kind of important to emphasize that and remind people of. But yeah, to your point on kind of broader approaches, asking schools to spend their own money, or asking schools to write a bunch of federal grants, and it's just it's not tenable, and it's not going to have long-term legs. And also, we know that there's really very little evidence that any of these kind of tech interventions do anything. But what we do know is that there are certain laws and certain approaches that can be put into place. One of them, but again, they still have holes. One of them is child access protection. We know that in states that hold parents accountable for locking up their guns and storing them safely, they have lower rates of suicide, homicide, and accidental shootings. And so I think 30 something states at this point have these cap laws. And, you know, what these do is it depends on the variation of the law that's put into place. Some of them are basically just saying, this is what you have to do. You have to lock up your gun. Others, there are more, legitimate punishments that the parents can be held accountable and can actually be prosecuted if the child gets a gun and then does something with them. So this has been happening in places like Michigan and Georgia more recently, where the parents are being held accountable. And I actually think that is a very good thing to do. But the fact is that Wisconsin has cap laws this week, and we don't know enough, I don't think, about how.
Unfortunately, in Wisconsin, what we don't have is standardization of those laws, and in Wisconsin, it's only children 13 years old or under apply to that. So you have to secure your weapon if there's a kid under 13 in that 13 or under in the house. In this case, the school shooter was a 15-year-old girl. So there's not a requirement if you have kids who are depressed and suicidal and talking about violence and wearing Columbine themed t-shirts. In Wisconsin, you're not required to lock the guns up in your house.
There you go. Yeah, thank you. And so that's a perfect example of, we talk about child access protection as this, umbrella set of laws, but there is nuance at the state level to where it can differ just by the age cutoff.
And we saw that in Virginia after the Rich Neck shooting 2 years ago, where a 6-year-old took a gun from his house and deliberately shot his teacher with the intent to kill her. That brought Virginia's storage laws into question because they're so vague that all it says is that the gun needs to be kept in a place that's not easily accessible by a child. And so this woman had her gun under a pair of jeans in her closet. And that was ultimately deemed something that they couldn't charge her with because her closet was not a place where you'd expect a kid to be. So yeah, well, one thing that's glaring is there's no standardization. And to have any meaningful laws that kind of apply to every state, they need to come down from the federal level.
Right. The standardization has to come down to the federal level because I think, I mean, we saw it happen recently. The federal government has been able to do, frankly, more than has been done in the last number of decades on the issue of gun violence, but they are still so, um, hamstrung by the kind of legislation that they're actually going to be able to pass, and that's certainly only going to get more difficult in the next 4 years. So you're right. There has to be suggestions from the federal government on exactly how to word this stuff, what safe and secure storage means, what the legal cutoffs need to be for, I didn't think that it was that confusing to define what a child is under 18 years old, but apparently, states have decided that it's more confusing than it actually is. And part of this is that there is still, I think, a lot of miseducation and misinformation on what secure storage even is. There's a large portion of firearm owners that don't store their guns in any kind of secure way whatsoever. But then there's a rainbow array of ways that you can store your gun in the home, in your vehicle, with a gun safe, with a cable lock. People don't like lots of these. The ones that people do like, biometric safes and things like that, are very expensive or not necessarily accessible. So I think in addition to that legislation and figuring out what the standardized law needs to be, and making sure that it's on the books for all 50 states, is then giving people access and the ability to actually securely store those guns, right? I, Even just as a consumer, I think it's a hard pitch to say, hey, you can go buy this gun and you got to store it safely, but we're not going to give you anything in order to do that, right? We're not going to teach you how to do it. We're not going to provide you with that when you go buy the gun.
It would
And
be
that's,
like if the pharmacist handed you a handful of opioid pills and they were not in a plastic container and they didn't have a childproof lock. Like we do all kinds of common sense um, risk mitigation and injury prevention things everywhere. There's a reason the pesticide, has a really complicated top to open. Yet a gun which can kill one person or many people is just sold in a bag with as much ammunition as you want, and really no instructions as to how to keep or use it safely. In Florida, where I live, just about a mile from the Pulse nightclub, you can walk into a store now in Florida and there's no licensing requirement, there's no training requirement, and you can walk out of the store with a handgun or with an assault rifle, and you can do whatever you want with it.
yeah. And I think the optimistic view, which I always try to have, is that this is a site where there's actually a lot of overlap, right? For people who, you might call gun safety and people you might call gun rights. I think that there is wide agreement that we don't want kids taking guns in and shooting others, right? I think there's very few people who say that that is just the cost of doing this.
Yeah, and if a
Um,
school has a $3.5 million budget for a very specific single use piece of software, how many gun safes could $3.5 million buy for that school district? I think it's also interesting that the shift in the firearms industry over the last 10 years is really towards, um, your compact semi-auto handguns and then your highly customizable kind of AR-15 type rifles. And by some industry estimates, there's about a 5x profit margin on those. So, if an AR-15 rifle is $1,000, it means it's 200 at cost, and that company's making $800. Have some regulation that you need to have a safe storage, a a safe storage device that people want, not a $2 cable lock with a junky combo lock on the bottom of it. Make a mandate that there's an option of consumer friendly, desirable safe storage locks and devices that have to be sold with every firearm.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. That mandate can't come though until we have the technology, whether it's, biometric guns, right? And we're a long way off from those, a long way off from adoption there, or biometric safes, or something that people really want to use that you can make and produce and then disseminate to scale, right? Ideally, supported by legislation that requires it to the manufacturers. And this is where there's so much room for innovation and, frankly, so much room for companies to make money,
And
right? Like,
bipartisan action. I mean, these things are popular. Nobody who's a gun owner wants their gun to be used in a school shooting, uh, aside from a small niche group of parents who it appears that they do. But we've got to figure out how to address that. But the other thing that I don't understand why it doesn't get bipartisan unanimous support is guns are being clearly marketed and designed specifically for kids. You go into a gun store right now, there's a $200 handgun, company called Taurus. It's almost all plastic, and it comes in hot pink and camouflage and all kinds of colors and patterns. And so, like, there's no adult who's carrying around a hot pink camouflage $200 pistol. That is a gun that is being designed and marketed and designed for teens and children. And you can buy versions of just about every gun on the market on Amazon right now in an airsoft replica that's exactly the same weight and dimensions. Those are also designed for children. So it seems like there are these two bipartisan pieces that can take an enormous onus off of schools rather than making schools responsible for keeping kids safe from gun violence. Let's make it really accessible for people to lock their guns up in ways that they want to use those locks. And let's stop marketing to children.
yeah, I completely agree. This is where I think, you know, we've been talking just a couple months ago, I might have been more optimistic, but for years now, the political ties have been such that anybody who was kind of advocating for gun safety and talking about marketing for children or talking about innovation in storage, all they were doing was swimming upstream against a torrent of protections that, gun rights groups had put in place for decades before, right? There have been all of these lobbying, lobbying attention and protections put in place for, decades now, that have created these. I think that the tides are starting to turn, and where there is more political will from a broader coalition of gun safety folks, that are not having to spend every day just swimming upstream against these protections. There's still too many that exist. But now is kind of the time to kind of switch that focus and say, okay, we're not just trying to undo everything that's already been done. Now we have to start pushing toward some of these bigger streams, of innovation and change. I
And
see it, I was just going to say, I see it from the research perspective. Researchers are much more likely to be thinking about these broad coalitions. They're focusing a lot more on storage, and we have papers that find people hate cable locks, right? They give them out at every, opportunity, but nobody wants to use them. They get thrown in the trash, right? Weirdly, though, we didn't know that until relatively recently. And so this is where, again, I think that there's some optimism for that tide shift that might be changing the way we're thinking about it.
Yeah, and just to unpack that, because I think a lot of the people that listen to this are probably not gun users, but the cable lock is basically like a big version of the lock that you'd put on your school locker. But instead of the metal U on the top, it has a big long steel braided cable, and you put that through the barrel of the gun and it comes out where the rounds would be inserted. And when that lock is in there, there's no way that you can either load or fire the gun. But it's clunky and it's cheap, and the lock is going to break after it gets opened and closed a couple times because there's a mandate that the manufacturers have to give that, but they're giving you the crappiest version possible. In addition to like larger political coalitions building, I think there's this elephant in the room, which is the civil liability that school districts are going to potentially face. There was a shooting at Michigan State on campus about 2 years ago, and I think it's now more than $100 million in lawsuits against the state and against that school. And if you're, a donor or an alum or a booster, you don't want your money going to paying out a settlement. And the big one that's going to take a number of years to resolve is there's a $28 billion class action lawsuit naming everybody involved in the Uvalde school shooting response. And $28 billion is more than Texas's state rainy day fund. That's a pretty significant amount of the federal budget or the federal deficit. And that's more than any insurance pool is going to pay out there. So you have a school shooting in Uvalde has the potential to bankrupt the entire jurisdiction. And once you get to facing that reality as a taxpayer, as a user of services in that area, do you want to implement some common sense regulations that prevent that from happening? Or do you want to risk your entire community being bankrupted?
Yeah, this is where, though, I think the bad actors or even just the uninformed actors that are in the tech space that are trying to pitch their solution would make the exact argument you just made and then say, well, compared to 28 billion, $3 million a year for your school district is a drop in the bucket to protect yourself, right? And so that easily gets flipped by people who are trying to say that the tech space is the real solution here. And look, technology might save us in some way down the future with innovation, but right now that is just not the case. And so, you kind of talked about holding gun marketers accountable to what they can and cannot say. But we've also talked in this conversation about holding the tech providers accountable for what they can and cannot say. And I think that it's those are the arguments that they are going to continue to make, that just invest in my tech and then you won't have that civil liability unless we make it clear that they are not allowed to say the things that are going to mislead school administrators and people that are actually paying for those. Yeah, so it's a reality that we all have to confront, and we have to make sure that reality doesn't get twisted by the kind of middlemen tech players in all of this.
And that's something that's going to be difficult to see what happens over the next 4 years if we move into a federal regulatory climate which is more permissive and caters more to business. Because really, a school administrator is not a security expert. Your school board members are not security experts. They're going to listen to whatever a vendor, especially if that vendor has a bunch of former police officers and Secret Service agents that are all employed as their salespeople. That vendor is going to have a very convincing sales pitch. The only protection the school district is really going to have is a federal regulator who knows more coming in to say, this is what you can say or can't say. This is how we're going to hold you accountable for deceiving customers. And the unfortunate thing in the tech space is that people have been tricked and they continue to be tricked again. Theranos was the most valuable biotech company in the entire world for a period of time, and it literally did absolutely nothing. And so you need to remember that any one of these magic school security products could literally be nothing except for a black box with a blinking light on top. And if you don't ask the tough questions, and if there's not help from the federal government to kind of regulate this BS, then you're going to have a lot of taxpayer dollars get wasted.
It's such a good point, David, because you're right. A lot of these companies kind of present and market with the legitimacy of, former police, FBI, Secret Service, and often former military, right? And so there is this sense that, look, we have military background, we have security background, we know what all of this is, we know how to design the best things to keep you safe. And the fact is that despite the backgrounds that folks have, they do not know because there is no research and there is no evidence on these kind of technological things that are going to keep people safer, right? If people can start showing me randomized control trials when these are put and not put into schools and what it's preventing, then we can have a serious conversation. But otherwise, it's just tech with a sheen of kind of security legitimacy, um, really preying on fear in a lot of ways. Parental fear, administrative fear, civil liability fear, all of these different angles. And it appears that they're working quite well, but just because they're working and making people money doesn't mean they're making anybody safer. And if the data is showing anything, it's doing quite the opposite.
And just because they're being sold now doesn't mean that they're going to be sold in the future. I mean, Theranos was the future of medical care, and it was completely fabricated. Facebook was not using any user data until we found out that actually Facebook was taking all of the user data. Like, big companies have not operated in our best interests many different times, and we need to understand that a lot of the players in the school security space are probably not operating in their customers' best interest. So this was a lot of doom and gloom. We talked about all of the attacks that didn't get prevented. We talked about how this supposed Swiss cheese model of all of these different components of security is actually just lots of overlapping holes that don't do anything particularly useful. But there is a common thread in all of these incidents, and it's that school shootings, deliberately planned attacks, are not random. There are weeks, months, and years of warning signs. There are overt warnings during every one of the planned attacks at schools this year, including in Madison, Wisconsin this week. There are pictures on social media of the 15-year-old girl wearing the same t-shirt as the Columbine shooters at a gun club with her dad. One person needs to see that warning sign, needs to say something about it, and not lock the girl up forever, but have somebody talk to her. Find out, what does that t-shirt mean? Why are you wearing it? Why are you thinking the things that you're thinking? What are the points in your life with your parents' divorce or bullying or whatever else that are causing these stressors? All of that stuff is low cost. And these lowest cost things that are going to help a teenager or child, whether it's physical abuse, psychological abuse, drug abuse, feeling suicidal, feeling depressed, the solutions to identify those problems and address them are either free or almost no cost at all. So, Dan, what would your kind of perfect landscape of making schools more secure through making students better, increasing wellness, what would that be? What would you like to see?
Sure. So this kind of conversation gets complex because I think that in some ways, a lot of people will say, "Oh, we just need to, provide more mental health services. We need to improve mental health," and then people are going to pick up a gun and shoot others. And I think that the argument is actually quite the opposite. We know that there are small numbers of folks who have very serious mental illnesses, and that might be attributed to their violence. But the mental health is actually on the back end of all the people that end up surviving this violence. So I think you're talking about a needle in a haystack if you're trying to prevent cases just by improving things like wellness or mental well-being. But your point on, what some people would call leakage, right? This idea that there are signs, days, weeks, months, years beforehand that somebody is going to engage in violence. That is very real. And I think that we're becoming a lot more hip to that, although it's taken far too long. The question is then, what does that look like, and how do you address it? There are things like, kind of, if you see something, say something campaigns that people put in schools. Some schools will have threat assessment teams where, a school psychologist or a teacher can go and kind of bring this to administrators, and then the child can kind of be triaged to see. But there's a lot of opportunity for false positives, right? Just because somebody wears a t-shirt doesn't mean that they're going to go commit an act of violence, right? We know that's video games and music and all the other kind of boogeymen that are often attributed to violence. So that's not causal. But in addition to that just being difficult with false positives, is I think that there's not a standardized approach, right? You're talking about legislative standardization, but the schools that do have threat assessment approaches, there's not necessarily a guidebook on what the best practices are, what actually works, or what resources are needed and needs to be included. So I think kind of coming to an agreement on what that needs to look like so that it can be implemented at the school level is really important. But here's where I think there actually is opportunity for maybe some technological innovation, right? I think in 2024, we're at a place now where we're really looking hard at the role of social media in the lives of our children is, and how damaging it can be or not, depending on, what kind of questions you're asking. Um, but we know that kids are using social media constantly. And this is an opportunity where we don't just create a surveillance state for children using social media, but where we can put the onus on some of these platforms, a la TikTok, a la Facebook, Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever it is, to actually do some of the threat assessment that might be baked into some of their applications. And we could have a whole other podcast on what that might look like and who might be involved. But again, I worry about just saying, if you see something, say something to teachers who are not trained or standardized in any way, where the site of so much of this leakage and opportunity for threat assessment is on the internet, on the platforms that could be doing a lot more to catch this stuff and make people safer, before.
And those are the companies that have more resources than just about any other company in the world. The same way that a gun manufacturer with a 5x profit on an AR-15 can afford to give you a nice safe, the social media companies can afford to be employing a team that is continuously looking at this. They're doing it at a very, very small scale and really not a meaningful scale based on the amount of information that gets posted. Dan, you alluded to maybe a second podcast about what things would look like in terms of the approach to filter information from social media. I'm in the process of writing my dissertation about using AI and large language models with different sets of prompts to be able to analyze the text of ambiguous online threats and see if those models are more or less effective than humans. And so far, I did a study of 240 school police officers assessing ambiguous threats, and I got extremely wide variability in the way that they assess these scenarios. A large language model in initial tests actually did better than these real human police officers. So I think that can be kind of a twofold conversation. One, around what do the platforms do, but also what can technology do? Because we're at a point where it's not about a human in the loop anymore. It's about the human may actually be a worse decision maker and the weakest part of the link, where we can have an AI model that can actually do a lot of this work faster and more accurately than people can.
That's exactly what I would have said, that any large language model is going to need it has to be trained on the right data, right? It has to be trained to understand and be able to find what it needs to find. And so there is the human component in doing that. But yeah, I mean, look, every podcast out there right now is talking about the opportunities and possibilities of artificial intelligence and large language models. Gun violence prevention should be no different, right? Especially when we're talking about these kind of even harder to predict incidents of school shooting. And so your dissertation is going to be extremely important. And I think this is where more folks that are doing gun violence research need to work with computer programmers and people who are in different disciplines, work with engineers thinking about gun mechanics, all of these kind of cross-disciplinary approaches to violence prevention. It's not just public health, not just criminology, and it's not just medicine. This is where there is so much space for that innovation. And so, yeah, every social media platform is baking artificial intelligence into their platform as we speak. Every search engine is doing it. A component of that should have to do with threat assessment. And we have to ask really hard questions about what that looks like ethically, what the response is, if there is indication of threat, right? Because we don't want this to quickly turn into false positives and constant surveillance. Um, but there has to be a middle ground where we sacrifice something in order to be safer. And I think that's a conversation worth having.
Yeah, and we need to dream big on these because it's such a cliche term now to say moonshot. But we've had a couple of moonshots in our lifetime where in a very short period of time, an accepted paradigm completely changes. And the original moonshot is within 10 years, we're going to go from no space program to a person on the moon. But we've done that with other things. In the 1990s, we made a decision that commercial airline crashes were unacceptable. And we've gone from having 1 or 2 commercial airlines crash every year for the entire history of aviation into there has not been an accidental major carrier crash in the US in almost 20 years. We took something that was a norm, something that killed children and families and your relatives randomly, and said, we're not going to accept it anymore. And after 9/11, we said there's a terrorist attack that happened. We are going to completely restructure the Constitution and completely restructure the federal government to make sure that there's not another major terrorist attack on US soil. And there hasn't been. So things that seemed unstoppable were all stopped. Things that seemed unchangeable were all changed. And we have the power to do that with gun violence at schools. It doesn't need to happen this way. Guns don't need to be the leading cause of death for children in the United States. So Dr. Dan Semenza from Rutgers University, thank you so much for coming today. He's a professor of sociology and criminology. We didn't even get a chance to talk about the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center, but I guess that'll be on the second episode as well. So Dan, thanks so much for coming today.
Thanks so much for having me, David. I appreciate it.